Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Well, the United States Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, a 100% diversity, equity, and inclusion nomination for that role. Again, Lloyd Austin is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, a complete and utter diversity hire. Was he the right person and the most qualified person to fill the role as Secretary of Defense? And the answer to that is absolutely not. So within the last 24 hours, Lloyd Austin has declared that if the Russian Federation defeats the Ukraine, it will most likely mean war against Russia, meaning the United States will probably have to fight a war against the Russian Federation. It will lead to the Third World War, because that is what will happen. Now, does Lloyd Austin study history at all? I have to ask that question. If we go back to, say, 1989, 1988, 1987, the 1980s, and we tell the Soviet Union that in about 40 years, this war will occur, the war we're seeing now, that Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia will become part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That the North Atlantic Treaty Organization will be actively pursuing Ukraine, part of the former Soviet Union, to become part of NATO. What do you think would happen? Would we have seen the opening up, Glasnost? Would the Soviet Union have fallen? Would there have been a Third World War? I would say most likely. Most likely, we would have, if the Soviet Union could see into the future, the Cold War would have turned into a hot war. Without a doubt. So this notion that, hypothetically, if the Russians take control of Ukraine, it would lead to a Third World War. Well, look, the Russians essentially controlled Ukraine for decades via the Soviet Union. Did a Third World War occur? No, it didn't. Did a Third World War occur because the Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union? Not part of the Warsaw Pact, but an actual part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Third World War did not happen. Was it a wise decision by NATO to accept Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia into NATO? Probably not. From a strategic standpoint, incredibly difficult to defend. Incredibly difficult to defend. So probably not a wise decision from a military standpoint? Was it necessary? Was it necessary for the defense of Western Europe? Again, this is what NATO was created for. To defend Western Europe. Does this make Western Europe safer by taking in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former members of the Soviet Union? Knowing that when this occurred, that at a certain point, Russia may be in a much different position in terms of economic power, military power, than when this rapid NATO expansion occurred. Seems to me they were living in the present, and they weren't looking into the future. And I believe that even with the acquisition of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Russians seemed to be okay with it. They weren't happy about it. But for the Russians, Ukraine was the red line. Just as I've talked about before, if Mexico were to join some sort of Chinese military alliance, what would the U.S. do? If Chinese troops started pouring into Mexico, what would the United States do? Would it respond much like we have seen the Russians respond? Probably. I would even take it a step further. This would be more tantamount to a Soviet victory during the Cold War, and somehow there is a collapse of the U.S. government which sees Texas become independent, and then Texas joining some sort of Sino-Mexican military alliance. That would be more comparable to what has happened with the Ukraine. Again, this is not about defending Germany, France, even Poland, Austria, France, Italy, the United Kingdom. The core of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There was no threat. There is no threat. There is not going to be, if there is this hypothetical victory by Russia over the Ukrainians, in which we see the complete occupation of all of Ukraine. All of Ukraine. Will we then see a Russian invasion of Poland? No. That's not going to happen. First, you have to look at capability. After this very tough war against the Ukrainians, will the Russians have this capability of launching an invasion against Western Europe? And the answer to that is no. No. So it's interesting, we're hearing this rhetoric coming from this diversity, equity, and inclusion hire who is not read up on history. It's insanity. Craziness. Now, are the Russians more likely now to have a closer look at the status of the Baltic republics because of what has happened in Ukraine? I would say yes. Do the Russians now have a perception that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization seeks direct conflict with the Russian Federation? I would say that is reasonable. if this current conflict did not occur, I highly doubt that we would see the Russians take a much greater interest in NATO operations in the Baltic states. Finland, trying to join NATO, is putting itself in a position to go to war against Russia. Look, if the Nordic nation states want to create some sort of triple alliance or some sort of alliance with the Baltic states, fine, great. It would probably help them. But to become part of this all-encompassing NATO alliance, in which an attack on one means all become part of this global conflict, probably not the most reasonable decision. I don't believe that there was any discussion prior to the red line being crossed in Ukraine that the Russians were taking a close look at Finland. It was not happening. It wasn't even on the table. But the West wants Ukraine. And the Russians are saying, you can't have Ukraine. You've crossed the line. This was the line. You crossed it. Now, the West is going to have to reap what it sows. The Russians are eventually going to defeat the Ukrainians. Now, is that going to lead to a third world war? We'll see. Thanks for joining us today. More to come. We're watching the situation continuing, obviously, to escalate and get worse in Ukraine. As I've said before, right now, the world is closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any point in history, even greater than the Bay of Pigs. The problem is the uninformed urbanite in the United States is oblivious to what is happening. The average uninformed urbanite has no concept of how close we could be to a nuclear conflict. But here we are. Have a good day, everybody.